Imagine a skyscraper made of glass and steel, shimmering under the hot Texas sun. At the turn of the millennium, this building was the center of the financial universe. It was the headquarters of Enron, a company that promised to redefine the way the world thought about energy and commerce. But within those walls, something far more complex than business was taking place. It was a grand psychological experiment, led by a man who believed he was rewriting the rules of reality itself. That man was Jeffrey Skilling. Today, we look back at the corporate ruins he left behind. But we are not just looking at spreadsheets and bank statements. We are looking into the mind of a visionary who may have been his own most successful victim. When Enron collapsed, it did not just fail. It vanished. In an instant, $74 billion in market value was erased, leaving thousands of hard-working people jobless and their life savings turned to dust. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented, and at the center of the storm stood Skilling. The central question that has haunted investigators and psychologists for decades is a simple but terrifying one. Did Jeffrey Skilling consciously architect America's biggest corporate lie? Or did he genuinely believe his own brilliant, tragic illusion? To understand the answer, we have to understand the man. Jeffrey Skilling was not a typical executive. He was a man of immense intelligence, a graduate of Harvard Business School who possessed a fiercely competitive spirit. He was charismatically obsessed with performance. To Skilling, the world was divided into the brilliant and the irrelevant. He didn't just want Enron to succeed. He wanted it to be the ultimate expression of his own intellect. He fostered a culture that was almost Darwinian in its intensity, a place where the smartest guys in the room were rewarded and the weak were purged. This was a man whose entire identity was fused with the idea of success. For Jeffrey Skilling, failure was not just a business outcome. It was a psychological impossibility. This pathological inability to accept defeat created a toxic environment where the truth became a secondary concern. Under his leadership, Enron adopted a specific method known as mark-to-market accounting. On paper, it was a way to value future contracts, but in practice, it became a tool for fantasy. If Enron signed a deal that they hoped would make $1 billion over 20 years, they would record that $1 billion as profit immediately, today. They were counting chickens before the eggs were even laid, and often the eggs did not even exist. This created a meteoric rise in Enron's stock price, fueled by numbers that were increasingly detached from the actual cash flowing through the company. But Skilling did not see this as a lie. In his mind, he was simply seeing the future more clearly than everyone else. He was the architect of a narrative, and as long as the stock price kept climbing, the narrative was true. This was the incremental slide into deception. It did not happen all at once. It was a series of small, repeated decisions. Each time the reality of the market conflicted with the desired outcome, the narrative was adjusted. Distorted incentives and the pursuit of status drove the entire executive team to maintain the illusion at all costs. Skilling was at the top of this pyramid, and his cognitive dissonance grew with every passing quarter. He was surrounded by people who validated his genius, and he used his charisma to silence any skeptics. The internal friction between the objective financial reality and his personal belief system was becoming a chasm. But Skilling continued to bridge it with sheer force of will. He believed in the brilliance of his model so much that he likely could not conceive of it failing. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The pressure of maintaining such a massive illusion is a weight few human beings can carry for long. By the middle of the year 2001, the cracks were starting to show, not just in the company's books, but in Skilling himself. The gap between the image of the invincible corporation and the crumbling reality was becoming impossible to ignore. On August 14, 2001, Jeffrey Skilling did something that shocked the financial world and his own employees. He abruptly resigned as the chief executive officer. He cited personal reasons, claiming he wanted to spend more time with his family, but the timing was suspicious. It was only a few months before the entire house of cards would come crashing down in a heap of bankruptcy and scandal. Many assumed he was running away to hide his crimes, and in a legal sense, that may be true. But from a psychological perspective, the resignation tells a different story. He didn't just run to escape the authorities. He ran because his psyche could no longer bridge the gap between his belief and the impending doom. The visionary had finally reached the limit of his own self-deception. The man who refused to believe in failure was suddenly staring at the end of his world, and for the first time in his life, his intellect could not find a way out. He left the building, but the narrative he built remained behind, waiting to explode and change the landscape of American business forever. The architect was gone, but the ruins were just beginning to fall. As the dust from the collapse settled, the stage moved from the boardroom to the courtroom, where a battle of two entirely different realities unfolded. This was a psychological war between the two men who held the keys to the Enron kingdom. On one side stood Andy Fastow, the chief financial officer who managed the hidden partnerships. Fastow's version was clear and calculated. To him, there was no room for ambiguity. It was a criminal conspiracy, plain and simple. He saw himself and Jeffrey Skilling as the architects of a system designed to deceive the public. Fastow spoke of the fraud as a series of deliberate maneuvers to hide debt and inflate the stock price for personal gain. He was the pragmatist of the crime, the man who knew exactly where the financial bodies were buried because he had dug the graves himself. In his testimony, the grand vision was stripped away, leaving only the cold mechanics of theft. In contrast, Jeffrey Skilling lived in a different world. Even as he faced the weight of the federal government, his conviction in his own narrative remained unshakable. To Skilling, Enron was not a fraud. It was a revolutionary business model destroyed by external forces. He viewed himself not as a criminal, but as a misunderstood visionary betrayed by the markets and his own colleagues. In Skilling's mind, the failure was not a result of his actions or the accounting tricks used by Fastow. He believed it was a failure of confidence. He maintained that if the world had just believed in his vision a little longer, the brilliance of his creations would have eventually manifested. This created an incredible psychological friction. Fastow's reality was grounded in the mechanics of deception, while Skilling's reality was a high-concept dream that refused to die even in the face of ruin. The legal system has little patience for delusions. On May 25, 2006, these two realities collided in a Houston courtroom. The atmosphere was heavy with the expectation of justice. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including internal memos and records of millions of dollars in stock sales Skilling made, while publicly declaring confidence in the company's future. The jury was presented with 19 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and insider trading. When the word guilty was read 19 times, it offered a definitive answer to the Enron saga. The law had spoken, and Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Yet, the verdict only addressed the outcome of his actions, not his internal intent. It punished the crime, but it did not solve the mystery of his mind. This leads to a deeper question about justice and the human psyche. Did the legal system actually answer the question of Skilling's intent, or did it just punish the outcome? In the eyes of the law, the distinction between a man who lies to others and a man who lies to himself is often irrelevant. If the result is the destruction of billions of dollars, the punishment must follow. But for those trying to understand the collapse, the question remains, was Skilling a cold-blooded liar who knew the ship was sinking, or was he a captain who truly believed the water in the hull was a new type of fuel? The evidence of his stock sales suggests he knew the end was near, yet his public outbursts suggested someone genuinely outraged that anyone would doubt his genius. This dissonance suggests that the legal verdict, while necessary for justice, barely scratched the surface of the psychological complexity at play. For years, Skilling maintained his defiance from behind bars, refusing to accept the label of a fraudster. He was the ultimate believer, a man whose ego could not admit to a mistake. In 2013, a shift occurred. A resentencing deal was reached that would cut his sentence short by nearly a decade. In exchange, Skilling had to agree to stop all remaining legal appeals and forfeit millions of dollars. This moment represents a profound psychological discomfort. An innocent man who believes in his own truth would typically keep fighting until his last breath. For a man who viewed himself as a warrior for his own reality, this compromise felt like a surrender. Why did the ultimate believer finally stop? Perhaps the weight of the years finally crushed the illusion, or he realized that even the most brilliant narrative eventually runs out of pages. The chilling realization is that the believer and the fraudster were not two different people. They were not warring factions within his mind, struggling for control. Instead, they were the exact same person operating in complete psychological alignment. Skilling could be an effective fraudster specifically because he was a true believer. His ability to deceive others was powerful because he had first deceived himself with conviction. He did not have to pretend to be confident because his self-deception was so total that his confidence was genuine. This is the most dangerous form of leadership. It is not the leader who knows he is lying that we should fear, but the leader who is incapable of seeing the lie at all. As he sat in his cell, reflecting on the ruins, the line between his genius and his crimes became impossible to find. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in the fires of an unchecked ego and a refusal to acknowledge the limits of reality. The internal conflict that would have destroyed a lesser man was, for Jeffrey Skilling, resolved through a brilliant and terrifying form of psychological inversion. He did not wake up every morning with the intent to commit a crime, nor did he look in the mirror and see a villain or a common thief. Instead, he saw a pioneer who was simply miles ahead of the rest of the world. To Skilling, the complex accounting structures and the hidden debts were not evidence of fraud. They were the tools of a sophisticated financial strategy that the traditional business world was too slow or too dim to understand. He did not need to wear a mask to hide his sins, because he had successfully rationalized every corporate transgression as an act of innovative genius. In his mind, he was not breaking the rules. He was rewriting them for a new century, dragging a reluctant and outdated system into a future that only he could see clearly. This is the ultimate power of a high intelligence combined with an absolute refusal to fail. It creates an internal reality where the truth is whatever the ego needs it to be in order to remain standing. This transformation from a visionary leader to the architect of a corporate disaster did not happen in a single moment of clarity. It was the result of 1,000 small decisions, each one protected by a thick layer of ego and corporate tribalism. At Enron, being the smartest person in the room was the only currency that carried any value. When a culture is built on the absolute necessity of being right and being superior, admitting a mistake becomes a fate worse than death. This is how the slide into darkness truly begins. It starts with a slight adjustment to a balance sheet to meet an analyst's expectation for the quarter. It continues with a creative interpretation of a regulation that feels more like a clever loophole than a moral violation. Eventually, the culture becomes so insulated from the outside world that the tribe begins to believe its own propaganda. They were the self-proclaimed masters of the universe, and they felt that the universe had to conform to their demands. Skilling was the architect of this environment, but he was also its most loyal subject. He believed the lie because his entire identity was forged within its flames. When we look at the ruins of Enron today, it is easy to dismiss Jeffrey Skilling as a monster or a unique anomaly of history. But the truth revealed by his psychology is much more uncomfortable for the rest of us. He serves as a mirror for the human condition, reflecting how easily any professional can fall into the trap of self-deception. When our status, our wealth, and our very sense of self are tied exclusively to our performance, the human brain becomes incredibly efficient at filtering out uncomfortable realities. We see what we need to see to keep the narrative of our success intact. This is the hidden danger of the high achiever mindset that our society so often celebrates. The very qualities that drive a person to the top of a corporate ladder, such as extreme confidence, relentless persistence, and a refusal to accept limits, are the same qualities that can blind them to the edge of the cliff. Skilling's mind was not broken in the traditional sense. It was simply operating at the extreme end of a normal human tendency to protect the ego at any cost. The final resolution of this story came in February of 2019. After serving 12 years of his reduced sentence, Jeffrey Skilling was released from federal custody. Many observers expected a man humbled by the weight of his consequences, perhaps seeking redemption, or finally offering a long overdue apology to the thousands of families whose lives were devastated by his ambition. Instead, the world saw a man who remained fundamentally unbroken. He emerged from prison with the same defiant energy he had carried into the courtroom years earlier. Reports suggested he was already looking to start new business ventures, still insisting to anyone who would listen that he had done nothing wrong. To Skilling, the collapse of Enron remained a tragedy caused by a lack of market liquidity and a betrayal of confidence by the banks, never an indictment of his own character or his accounting methods. He remained the hero of his own story, even if the rest of the world saw him as the definitive villain of a modern cautionary tale. This brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the Enron saga. The danger to society is not just that large corporations are capable of lying for profit. The true danger is that human beings possess an infinite capacity to believe their own lies. When the lie is big enough and the believer is smart enough, the truth becomes a secondary concern. Jeffrey Skilling represents the absolute peak of this phenomenon. He did not just sell a fraudulent vision to the public and the shareholders, he bought into it himself with every fiber of his being. His life is a testament to the fact that high intelligence is no shield against delusion. In many ways, a powerful intellect only provides better tools for more sophisticated self-deception. It allows a person to build a fortress of logic around a fundamental falsehood, making them nearly impossible to reach with the light of objective reality. Perhaps the most chilling thought is that highly intelligent people are capable of committing massive fraud without ever seeing themselves as villains. They don't see the lives they ruin or the trust they break because they are too focused on the beauty of their own complex equations. They live in a world where the outcome justifies the narrative, and the narrative must always be one of triumph. As we reflect on the legacy of Enron and the mind of Jeffrey Skilling, we are left with a lingering and uncomfortable philosophical question. If the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, how would we even know if we were living inside one? The story of Enron is not just a story of money and greed. It is a story of the fragile line between visionary leadership and absolute delusion. Subscribe, because the answer to that question changes what the Enron story means for all of us.